the way to compete and win in Formula One is constant innovation.
The great irony of Formula One is this is a sport that is literally named after the rule book. Success in the sport is basically all about breaking the rules or bending the rules to the furthest point that you're able to while still technically adhering to them. But also the success of the series is really the fact that it kind of fosters that spirit of innovation and pushing the rule book. Part of the reason that Ferrari and McLaren and Aston Martin and those huge manufacturers are interested in being in F1 is because F1 really pushes right up against the very cutting edge of automotive design and engineering. It is a very nimble, agile sport that has been able to sort of respond to changes in the way that we consume sports over the past 50, 60, 70 years in a way that many other sports haven't.
Prominent CEOs, leading economists, iconic investors, insights from the experts. The Walker Webcast with Willy Walker. See who's next.
Welcome to another Walker Webcast, and it's my great pleasure to have Jonathan Clegg and Joshua Robinson joining me to discuss their new book, The Formula. First of all, John and Joshua, I think I should be wearing a black T-shirt here. I feel overdressed in my collared button down. It's great to have you both in. I guess John, you're in New York, and Joshua, you're over in London.
I'm in Paris, actually.
You're in Paris. You're going to be there for the Olympics?
Absolutely, and John is coming over.
Oh, that's great.
You'll be there. Yep.
I'm jealous of that. That'll be really quite something. So let me do quick bios on the two of you, and then we'll dive into the book. Joshua Robinson covers European sports for the Wall Street Journal from Paris and London. Previously, he wrote features on New York sports and covered the New York Giants. He's a graduate of Columbia University. Jonathan Clegg is the Wall Street Journal sports editor based in New York. Previously, Jonathan was a senior editor on the digital platforms team, where he oversaw notifications and alerts. Before that, he was a reporter and editor on the sports desk, joining the Journal as its first European-based sports reporter. Jonathan is a graduate of the London School of Economics. Jonathan and Joshua are co-authors of 3 books: The Club, How the English Premier League Became the Wildest, Richest, Most Disruptive Force in Sport; Messi versus Ronaldo, One Rivalry, Two Goats, and the Era That Changed the World's Game; and the book that we're going to talk about today, The Formula, How Rogues, Geniuses, and Speed Freaks Re-Engineered F1 into the world's fastest growing sport. Let me start here. First of all, the book's an incredible read. As I wrote to both of you, I'm a quasi F1 fan because of my friendship with Greg Maffei at Liberty Media, and have had the opportunity to go to Miami, Vegas, and then most recently Monaco. So I've seen the sport as a spectator and a little bit of as an insider, and a lot of the people you talk about in the current chapter I've had the privilege of meeting. As I thought through all the characters that the two of you so well identify and portray and talk about their relevance to F1, I thought I'd run through and ask the two of you, who's the most important person to F1 from 1950 to where we are today? If you had to pick one person who says, without that influence, without that change, the sport isn't where it is today. So you got to start with Bernie Ecclestone. Then I put Enzo Ferrari and Ron Dennis from a design and sponsorship standpoint. Then you kind of go into the drivers and the great drivers of the Sennas and the Schumachers, the Hamilton or the Verstappen. Is any one of those so influential that you put a driver up there saying, without that driver, F1 isn't where it is? Then a little bit on the money side, McKinsey and CVC coming in as money. Ross Braun, designer of the double diffuser, which was innovative, or Adrian Newey and where he's taken design. Toto and Christian Horner as managers of the team and the way that F1 is now managed. And then into kind of the new era of the Sean Bratches, Chase Carey, Greg Maffei, David Hill from a media standpoint. And then the last one I'm going to ask you is COVID. So out of that whole list of everything that's made F1 what it is today, what's the one name that you would put as it relates to why F1 is where it is today?
I think John and I would give the same answer here, and it's Bernie. You have to remember that when Bernie Ecclestone effectively took over F1, he was a team owner, And he basically took his role as the junior team owner in that room to mean, you know what, I'm actually going to make a new way to just run this circuit, run this roadshow more efficiently. He said to the other team owners, listen, what I'll do is I'll organize the transport and the travel, and I'll negotiate with promoters, all for a very small percentage, 2% of gate receipts and everything else. And he saw the opportunity where none others were even aware of it. He saw television as the primary revenue generator. He wrangled the promoters and the teams in a way that no one had done before. And frankly, no one had interest in doing. The other team owners were all kind of these boy racers who'd come out of post-World War II Britain, who wanted to build fast cars and race them around the world. That was their main interest. Bernie's main interest was making money. He was a used car dealer who understood the logistical side, who understood that they needed to grow and that you needed tension at every layer of the sport to keep making money. So whether that was between the team owners, between the promoters, between the broadcasters, he always had someone else lined up to drive the price north.
John, you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, simply said, when you think about what F1 is today and what Formula One means, and you think of the global road show that takes place in like the most glamorous spots in the world. I mean, that was Bernie's vision. Like what F1 has come to symbolize was Bernie's vision for the sport, which was, that it would be, like I say, the most sort of glamorous, dangerous, and technologically advanced sport possible, and through sort of sheer force of will, most of the time he made that happen.
Start a legacy. Start turning dreams into realities. A better world begins with you. Better communities start with us.
I guess one of the things that let me for a moment on that. I mean, Bernie, at the height, when Bernie tried to take F1 public in the early 2000s, the value of it was $4 billion, was what Morgan Stanley, I think you both report on, was about the value that they were going to take public. Bernie's way of management, lack of transparency and things of that nature made it so that the IPO didn't work. He then went and raised a bunch of debt and the value of it fell down accordingly. But I mean, Liberty bought the franchise for $4.4 billion, and it's now worth at a minimum 22 to 23 billion is what the quoted price is, and heard all sorts of rumors as it relates to how much more it's worth. I guess my question to it is, it was sort of this small niche business sport under Bernie's leadership, and no doubt it wouldn't exist today without all the things that he did. And yet at the same time, I went rafting here in Idaho on Saturday, and I'm in the raft and the guide is asking me, where we've been this summer. And I say that my girlfriend and I went to watch Monaco, and the kid almost fell out of the boat. And he goes, oh my God. And for like half an hour, he's talking about how much he loves F1 and all this. And I go, when did you become an F1 fan? And he goes, oh, Drive to Survive. I knew nothing about F1 until I watched Drive to Survive. So I guess my question is, I get that it wouldn't be here without Bernie, but does that, the relevance of F1 as it relates to that, the overall knowledge of it and the size of it and the impact of it has only come recently?
Yes and no. I mean, there was a global F1 sort of relevance peak in the 1990s, sort of following on from the Prost and Senna era before the Michael Schumacher prime. And at that point, it was wildly popular almost literally everywhere but the United States. It was huge in Europe, enormous in Asia, something that I think we don't always grasp in Europe or North America, because that was one of the huge drivers of F1 for a long period. But yes, you're right in saying that this new leap comes from the Liberty era. Bernie took F1 about as far as it could with his business chops and also his sometimes dubious business practices. The whole web of interconnected promoters and broadcasters and everything else was really only transparent inside Bernie's head, which is no way to run a modern business. as you rightly point out, when it comes time to attempt an IPO, none of that is possible to explain to investors. None of that is possible to unpack. So what the CVC era is really significant for kind of cleaning up the business, streamlining a lot of processes, and taking all of those responsibilities that Bernie had consolidated in his 5'2" frame, and spreading them out to proper business departments, people who wrote things down on paper, who didn't just operate on a wink and a handshake. And so once that business was made a true 21st century business, it was possible for someone like Liberty to come in and take it to the next level. So those things had to happen sequentially. You couldn't have had Liberty or a company like it come in the 1990s and take it over, just because the business would have been too chaotic to do anything with at that stage.
Yeah, and I think and to that point, even the remarkable success and sort of transformation that F1 has undergone under Liberty. I don't think even Liberty envisaged this happening when they bought it. As you mentioned, quite rightly, like without without Drive to Survive and COVID, which then made Drive to Survive this huge global hit, I don't think we'd be talking about F1 as a $5 billion enterprise.
Yeah. So let's rewind, because you spend a lot of the book, if you will, talking about the history of F1. And I think one of the very interesting things that you both point out is, as in the name of the actual league, Formula One, the formula, the actual rules and regulations are in the title. And you make the point that the way to compete and win in Formula One is constant innovation, and that this sport is constantly reinventing itself. Unlike, the rules of golf, as you point out, were made back in the 18 whatevers and have never changed. And there's still 18 holes and all that stuff. And you talk about tennis. And it's very interesting how this sport seems to have this great premium on innovation and adaptation. And yet at the same time, you also throughout history see these teams that figure out how to innovate better than everyone else. They become the dominant force, and then they go and change the rules so that competitive advantage doesn't exist anymore. Talk for a moment, either one of you, about that, because I found it to be incredible, particularly when we get in the computer era in 1992, and when Williams really brings in the first use of computers into the cars. But talk about that, because it seemed like the moment that anyone gets a competitive advantage, they just go and take it away.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's the great irony of Formula One is, as you mentioned, this is a sport that is literally named after the rule book. Formula One, like you say, refers to the technical specifications that the cars have to stick to. But success in the sport is basically all about breaking the rules or bending the rules to the furthest point that you're able to, while still technically adhering to them. So this is a sport that is essentially about finding loopholes in the rule book and then exploiting those to maximum advantage. And that has really been the history of F1, and the most successful teams in F1 have been the ones that have sort of successfully navigated those gray areas in the rule book. And a bunch of the people that you mentioned previously, Ross Brawn and Adrian Newey, and right the way back to Colin Chapman, who was the sort of first of these kind of innovative designers. These were men who were experts at spotting those loopholes and and driving right through them. And that sort of spirit of sort of innovation, but also of sort of skirting the rules and really brushing up against the very edges of what's legal versus illegal is the whole sport is really imbued with that attitude that this is a sport about trying to like I say, trying to bend the rules as much as you possibly can without getting caught. And I think at various stages that has sort of blown up in F1's face with some very terrible instances of cheating or spying, industrial espionage, teams making their drivers crash into the wall at 70 miles an hour on purpose. Sometimes that sort of spirit has kind of overstepped the mark, and F1 has sort of paid the price. But also the success of the series is really in large part down to that the fact that it kind of fosters that spirit of innovation and pushing the rule book, which, again, is also something that has attracted a bunch of the manufacturers who come in and make these teams. Part of the reason that Ferrari and McLaren and Aston Martin and those huge manufacturers are interested in being in F1 is because F1 really pushes right up against the very cutting edge of automotive design and engineering, and they're then able to use some of those developments in their road cars, which is why these manufacturers are so interested in being in the sport. But yes, that sort of spirit of innovation has existed in F1 right from the very beginning, and is a sort of large part of its success. And even the success that we talk about in the Netflix era, I think it like I say, that it is a very nimble, agile sport that has been able to sort of respond to changes in the way that we consume sports over the past 50, 60, 70 years. In a way that many other sports haven't.
You talk at the beginning of the book about the fact that the aerodynamics and the investment in the actual vehicles is now sort of the name of the game. But there was a period of time where there was much less technology and much more focus on the actual drivers. And yet, if I think about the great drivers in F1, if you think about the Senna really was the one who seemed to be the most gifted actual driver on a kind of a like-for-like car. When you think about someone like Schumacher and how well he did, the focus on tires and what they did with Bridgestone to make that car so fast, they then went and kind of reverted away from it. And obviously, both Senna and Schumacher had extremely unfortunate ends to their racing careers, one dying and the other one being put into a coma. But the point is that it seemed like, and then you go on to Hamilton, and Hamilton seems to have a competitive advantage from the car. And when that gets changed, he backs off. And now you have Verstappen, who stepped in again, seems to have the car. One of the things that I find to be very sort of confounding to me, and I don't want to jump all the way to the end, but as you talk that through, John, this sort of leads to it as it relates to the actual drivers and the drivers' capabilities, is it would seem that Verstappen would be sitting in the catbird seat right now, in the sense that Liberty doesn't seem concerned about one team having a dynasty. Throughout Bernie's ownership, he seemed to say, if somebody gets too far out ahead of everyone, I got to change the rules and make it a level playing field again. Liberty doesn't seem to be saying that. And yet Max, when he went to Vegas, the world is his oyster, and he's the one who's squawking about the fact that he doesn't like the fact that it's kind of become too prime time and for television, versus all those other drivers who had to deal with the changing of the rule books. Talk for a moment about that, because I find it to be interesting that Verstappen seems to be the one pushing back on the new era when the playbook seems to be totally tilted towards him right now.
Well, there's a couple things happening. One is, as we know in F1, nothing is forever. The rules are changing again for 2026. And it's unclear who's stolen a march on developing the next set of specs. Lewis Hamilton, for instance, has bet that it's going to be Ferrari by signing to move over there next year. Mercedes has promised that it's going to be competitive again, and is already showing signs of that in that direction already. And Red Bull is Red Bull and has the Adrian Newey advantage. And as long as he sticks around and works on that 2026 car, you can bet they're going to be in the mix. But the other thing about Max is, there is, I think, an understanding from Liberty that the Netflix era and that flood of new fans marked a kind of reset in the history of F1. There were dynasties, and they're very happy to trade on that history and look at the Schumacher years and say this was one of the greats, the Senna and Prost years, and saying these are our heritage. But there's a recognition that there has to be a kind of, you have to allow for new greatness, so that in 5-10 years, all these new fans can remember an era when one of these all-time greats was made. And so if the sacrifice is a couple of years of predictable championships, Liberty and Stefano Domenicali, who is the current CEO of F1, are prepared to accept that. And what they'll point out also is that the rest of the field is much closer than it's ever been. We recently had a qualifying session where I think the first 10 cars were within a matter of tenths of a second. Those are the wins that Liberty is seeing now.
Unlike Senna's Monaco 123, what was it, 123.99, I think, which flabbergasted me, John, that there was absolutely no tape of it. I mean, you think about that, the greatest lap ever, and they don't even have a video of it.
Mm-hmm.
I know. It's one of those things that just, gives it even more of a sort of like mythic quality, is the fact that like we know that this was the greatest lap that ever happened around Monaco, and yet there's no footage of it. You just see Senna in the background of other, while the camera trails a different car, you can see Senna screaming around the corner and in the background. But yeah, that was Senna's famous lap around Monaco in 1988. But yeah, I mean, just to go back to your point about Max, even Bernie, who, as you say, was didn't like Formula One to become too formulaic, didn't like the same teams to win year after year. Even he allowed Schumacher, to win 5 in a row before he flipped the rules on Ferrari. Bernie's big fear, to go back to the Williams situation that you referenced earlier, he was sort of fine with one driver winning time after time, as long as the credit was given to the driver. His great fear was the idea that the sport became all about the car, and that the drivers didn't matter. And that's what Williams got very close to in the early 90s, when they became the first team to really experiment with computers in the car. This was a time when computers now is in pretty much every road car, but back then, computers were still big, bulky machines that, the size of a suitcase, and the idea of having one inside a Formula One racing car was, completely fanciful. But Williams, did figure out a way to get a very small computer in their car, which, even though the computer itself was small, the impact it had on the performance of the car was astronomical. This was a system that enabled the car to differentiate its suspension as it went around each corner, so that the car would remain exactly level, which improves its aerodynamic performance. That single innovation propelled Williams far ahead of everyone else on the track, the seconds ahead per lap, which is in F1 terms is completely crazy. And that was when Bernie really came in and jumped down hard and said, we can't have computers driving the car. Formula One can accept a certain level of dominance from one team or one driver, but it has to be the driver that's doing the thing, not a computer bolted onto the car. And overnight, they outlawed computer-aided cars, and that the era of computer technology in F1 was essentially shut down right there and then, and still hasn't been introduced even now, 20 years later.
It's really quite something. I mean, it's unbelievable. The launch control that they put in. I mean, obviously there's so many computers monitoring everything going on now. It was also interesting there, Jonathan, that you went from that, the focus on the computers, and then they stripped that out. So then Ferrari turned to the tires.
That's right.
One of the things I thought was so interesting was Bridgestone, the technology that went into the Bridgestone tires that made Ferrari so successful. Then the change for a safety standpoint after Senna dies, which supposedly made it so that they wanted them to have slower tires, to which Bridgestone says, hold on a second. Why? No, it was Goodyear. Excuse me. I got that wrong. Goodyear said, why would I be developing a tire that has a slogan behind it to make you slower? And so Goodyear pulls out, and then Bridgestone steps in. Talk about that for a moment, because I thought that was fascinating about the way they changed the rules to try and make it safer, and in the process lost the biggest tire manufacturer in the world.
Well, this is kind of one of the fundamental tensions at the heart of F1, which is selling that, they don't talk about it, but they are trading on that illusion of danger, that threat that something could go very wrong. And it's one of the points that Bernie Ecclestone made in speaking to us was, and it's quite a callous point, but the idea that interest in F1 was never as high during his era as it was immediately after Senna's death. That there's a kind of morbid curiosity that drew people to the sport, and considering that back in the 70s, you had drivers dying every few weeks in fiery wrecks. The changes that they've made for safety are one of its great success stories. But that danger, that thrill that of knowing that drivers are going right up against the edge of grip, potentially in a wall at every corner, there is something there.
Yeah, you point out in the book that since Senna died, no Formula One driver has died since. So that's 94 to current day. Am I right on my dates?
Jules Bianchi had a crash and then spent a long stretch in a coma, but they haven't had an on-track fatality since Senna.
Yeah. It's really, I mean, it's really quite, and as you point out in the book, and I think there were 24 F1 drivers who died in the first 15 years of the series, from 50 to 65. I think I'm remembering that. So to exactly your point, Josh, it was, it was super dangerous at the beginning. And yet there is that sense that we watch because we've got that sort of morbid curiosity, sort of like why people watch cage fighting, or and at the same time, it's actually become a rather safe sport.
Yeah, completely.
That's right. That's right. And I think, as you mentioned, like the what's fascinating is that the slower tires introduced after Senna, then being seized upon by Ferrari as the sort of basis for their years of dominance, is again this a really clear illustration of that sort of quest for innovation and looking for loopholes around every corner, because every team was presented with the same problem there, that they had to change the tires, and then Bridgestone comes in as the F1's official tire supplier, and after a couple of years, then Goodyear returns, or Michelin returns rather. Most of the field then joined Michelin. Ferrari decides to stick with Bridgestone and turns that relationship into its advantage. And like you say, for Ferrari, it was the tire. Williams, it was the onboard computers. Pretty much every dynasty through F1 history can be explained by the fact that they have taken one component and really found a way to sort of weaponize it, in a way that the rest of the field has not caught up with. Right at the very beginning, Lotus, Colin Chapman was the first F1 designer who really appreciated the importance of aerodynamics. So he had his famous sort of ground effects car, which felt like it was sucked to the road, so you could corner at extremely high speeds. Then you have Ron Dennis, who you mentioned earlier, the very famous McLaren team principal in the 1980s, the guy who oversaw Senna and Prost. He was the first guy who really recognized the value of sponsorship and how corporate sponsorship could sort of, give a team the resources that it needed to make the absolute best possible car. Williams is the onboard computer. Ferrari then becomes the tire, and then we get back to Red Bull, and again, Adrian Newey is the sort of modern day Colin Chapman, the guy who really understands modern aerodynamics better than anyone else. But again, that just shows, which sort of, as you mentioned, is one of the themes of the books. The theme of the book is that sort of spirit of innovation really has become sort of so pervasive in F1 that even when you try and slow down the cars to prevent accidents, some team will seize on it as a way to get ahead of the rest of the pack.
You mentioned sponsorship. I want to talk for a moment about tobacco's role and then the changing in sponsorship. Before I go to that, one of the things I was curious about was you mentioned that the Saudi investment in the Williams team, which was the first sort of Middle Eastern investment in F1. And the only condition of that was that the drivers, if they won, didn't drink champagne. I was just curious, is that why on the podium they spray champagne rather than drinking champagne? I was just curious whether if you went back in the annals of F1, when those Williams drivers got up there, instead of drinking, they started to spray, and that was the beginning of that sort of ritual that's happened in F1 subsequent to that Saudi investment.
I think the Williams guys didn't even spray the champagne. I think they just completely, they wanted no part. They didn't even hold the champagne, didn't spray the champagne, certainly didn't drink it. They wanted no part of the champagne. I think the reason that they spray the champagne rather than drink it is that they are so exhausted and dehydrated after completing a race that if they necked the champagne, they would be unable to walk off the podium. So, but yeah, that's F1 has been a real innovator in so many ways, but certainly in the realm of sponsorship, it really led the way in terms of both recognizing the sponsorship value that huge TV audiences could bring, but also, like you say, in recognizing that places like the Middle East, which now has its fingers in almost every sport. F1 was decades ahead of soccer, which I guess is the other sport that has really been transformed by Middle Eastern investment recently. F1 was decades ahead of getting Saudi money in, and recognizing that it provided a good platform for Saudi to advertise itself to the rest of the world.
So you talk about that, and clearly you both underpin in the book the fact that Bernie's focus, particularly in the latter years before it ended up getting sold, both CBC coming in and then Liberty taking it over, that Bernie's real focus was to the east of Prince's Gate. That if you talk to him about where's the future of F1, we're going east from here, not west. Let's talk for 2 seconds about the failed entries into the US market. I thought one of the things that you both underscored, which I thought was so funny, was when the Phoenix F1 race took place and there were, there were 15,000 people who showed up at the track to watch the F1 race on that Sunday. And there was a ostrich race on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona that had 75,000 people show up to it in comparison. I thought it was, I don't know how you two found that data point, but I was sitting there just crying with laughter, sitting there saying 15,000 people watch F1 and 75,000 were on the outskirts watching an ostrich race. Talk for a moment about why it was so difficult for F1 to break into the US under Bernie's ownership.
I think there was a long spell where Bernie will tell you that he blames the promoters. He thinks that, if you can't outsell an ostrich jamboree, then you really haven't done your job in advertising the race and getting people in, because he would leave it up to them. But the thing is about the US, there was already a racing tradition that was tied to another brand of racing. And so if you're going to go into Detroit and places like Indianapolis, it is tough to unseat the existing culture there. It's also tough to convince them to follow this very European thing with only a handful of American drivers in its history. Of course, Andretti was a world champion in the 70s, but it still wasn't enough to really latch on. And they kept changing. Bernie would get frustrated with the promoters locally, and he would change. They went through, I think, 8 or 9 different venues for US Grand Prix. But he eventually felt that the frustration wasn't worth it and pretty much gave up. There was a time, especially around the fiasco at Indianapolis. We mentioned tires before, but what happened there was the Michelin tires were found to be unsafe. This is Indianapolis 2007. The Michelin tires were deemed unsafe. Michelin couldn't get new tires in time for the race. And so what happened was, after a weekend of negotiation, on the first lap, nearly all of the field, all but 6 cars, pulled into the pits because they had these unsafe tires that were likely to blow up or rip mid-race and put their drivers in danger. And you had a race with 6 cars going round and round on Bridgestone tires. And so that was almost the last straw. The F1 came back for a little bit after that, but that was it in Bernie's mind. The US was done. He saw much more money, much more potential, much more advertising dollars and TV revenue in Asia. That was where he was always happy to go. And he'd been working on the Middle East and even places like the Soviet Union since the 80s. Those are the places he thought he could go in, do whatever he wanted. Bernie always said that he quite liked dealing with autocratic regimes because they just made it work. There was no question of having to please local officials or mayors having to, convince their potential voters that this was a good idea. Go into an autocratic nation, everything worked, never mind the cost locally to human rights or anything else. That's what Bernie wanted.
I thought it was interesting that you all pointed out that he turned down a meeting with Putin when they were talking about going to Sochi. I sort of asked myself, how many people actually turned down a meeting with Putin? I was like, he's like, I'm not going to go negotiate against that guy because he's going to win. So send me a signed contract and I'll go do it. I thought that was a great anecdote in the book.
Oh, I don't think it was because he's going to win. I think just Bernie doesn't get out of bed unless everything is on his terms.
Yeah. the Middle Eastern influence with Saudi, and then building you both write extensively about Bahrain and the building of the track in Bahrain. And then obviously the book ends on Abu Dhabi, which I want to save till the end, but I think that's such a fascinating, I mean, you couldn't have scripted it any better, but let's not jump ahead to Abu Dhabi for too quickly. But it felt like that Bernie was looking to the East, that he saw lots of dollars as far as sponsorship and things of that nature. But I guess it all plays into the teams and the audience the teams want to go after, and then the manufacturers. And at the end of the day, we can't forget about the role the manufacturers have played. Ferrari's the only one who's been there from the very beginning, the only one who's been in every single F1 season. There was a time there where Bernie was actually saying he didn't need them anymore, which I find to be quite incredible that there was ever a moment where he thought he didn't actually need them. But the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis, really changed F1. I mean, because there were all these automobile manufacturers who were going through such a tough time in 2008, 2009, 2010, many of them pulled back. Renault pulled back, Honda pulled back, Toyota pulled back. And it really changed the way that the constructors were focused on F1, where they felt like F1 went from being something that was super important to their brands and to their innovation to all of a sudden being a luxury that they could no longer afford as they were shutting down plants and pulling back. And now all of a sudden you have a complete food fight going on over constructors who want to get in, and BMW wants to get back in, and Audi wants to get back in. Jonathan, talk for a moment there about the importance of, if you will, the big automobile manufacturers to F1. And are we now at a moment where back in the day it was a nice luxury to have, then it went to seemingly a liability, and today it seems to be once again a must-have for every major automobile manufacturer in the world?
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think the relationship that the big car manufacturers have had with F1 has sort of changed a little bit over time. I think, right from the sort of very beginning, when F1 became what we sort of now think of today as F1, which was really the sort of like set 1970s, when it sort of transformed into the kind of traveling global circus that it is today. Right from the beginning, the big car manufacturers wanted to become involved. And I think, in the early years, like you say, that whole idea of, engineering and design developments from F1 finding their way into the road cars was actually true. They used to, Ferrari famously, its Maranello headquarters used to have the F1 factory on one side of the street and the road car manufacturing factory on the other side of the street. And the idea would be that ideas from the F1 side would filter across the street into the road cars. And I think that has remained true. That was true for these companies for a while. Now, the trouble is that when you start doing things like outlawing onboard computers, then the design and development that's happening in F1 moves away from what's happening in the road cars. So I think in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was also a sort of natural decoupling that happened, where the R&D that was happening for F1 was no longer really finding its way into the road cars as easily. And then you get, on top of that, the financial crisis that you mentioned, where F1 suddenly becomes at that time, teams were spending sort of $250 million a year on financing these teams. And that then becomes, a huge burden when you are unable to sell like cars anymore. And you also have, at that same period, there were, as I mentioned earlier, some of these very unsavory incidents happening. Spygate, industrial espionage, F1 becomes sort of, inextricably linked with this idea that everyone's cheating and stealing each other's ideas. Then following on from Spygate, there's Crashgate, where Renault forces their driver to smash into the wall on purpose to help his teammate bring out a safety car and help his teammate win the race. So I think the combination of those things, road car design moving away from what F1 was doing, the financial crisis, the sort of, these incidents that sort of tarnished the reputation of F1 globally, made it very easy for manufacturers who have been involved in F1 for a long time to step away. We don't need this right now. F1 is not, mission critical to our business. We're going to step back and step away. Now, what we've seen, how F1 responded to that was to start focusing much more on installing cost caps, which had been sort of mooted for a long time, but which the likes of Ferrari had always, bucked up against, because, in Ferrari's idea, F1 needed to be at the very pinnacle, the very cutting edge of automotive engineering, and any sort of cost cap that would, stop them pushing to the very limits of what they were able to do was not something they were interested in. The financial crisis, the fact that Honda and Toyota leave the sport, persuades F1 to take the issue of cost cap seriously. And over the past 10 years, that they have actually implemented a cost cap that sort of works. You still see some teams that seem to be able to sort of bend the rules of the cost cap even and get away with it, but it basically works. It broadly works. And F1 teams now are much less expensive to run relatively than they were in the early 2000s. Now, the fact that the cost cap has happened at the same time that the sport has also undergone this huge global resurgence under Liberty, where it is now, again, it's now cheaper to become involved, and the sport is more popular than ever. So now all the car manufacturers want to come back in. So that's why that's why the relationship between the car manufacturers and the sport has sort of evolved a little bit over the last 20 years, where there was this period where they were sort of less involved. It was too expensive. Costs were running out of control. Now the cost cap and the fact that the sport is more popular than it's ever been means they all want to get back in. And there is I can tell you, there is a list of car manufacturers who are unable to get in, but would dearly love to, if the field expanded beyond, 10 teams.
And one of the things that's important for people to keep in mind there is that in many, like in Monaco, there's no space for an 11th shed. And,
that's right.
And so one of the big issues that F1 is facing now is they've grown the number of races, which Verstappen, amongst others, has said is too many, and that they had to scale it back down. Sounds eerily similar to some major professional sports in the United States, as far as the players saying, "Hey, enough on adding 2 more games to the NFL season," for example. But the other issue is that there is just a physical issue. Las Vegas was built with the ability to have 12, 14 sheds down there on the paddock, and that would work. Whereas in places like Monaco, you literally can't fit it. It's just too tight. So that is one of the other things that they're struggling with right now as they're thinking about expansion.
I think there's also a feeling among the 10 current teams that they're the ones who built the current boom. And why should anyone else who comes in, to dilute their share in all of this by 9-10%, just reap the benefits without having spent the past 5 or 10 years sort of in the trenches with them.
And isn't that sort of the problem behind Andretti's request or desire to come in? Is Andretti thinks that he can buy in for $200 million, and really the value of the franchise right now is about $1 billion a team. And so there's just a huge bid-ask spread between what Andretti and Ford think they can buy in for and what the going price of one of those sheds is right now. Is that about right, Jonathan?
Yeah, that's basically it. That's basically it. And then I think that there's another, the other sort of part of this that F1 is sort of wrestling with as well is, and I'm sure we're going to, we'll be discussing Drive to Survive and how, how that's sort of worked to transform F1. But like, one of the great successes of Drive to Survive is that they've managed to make, characters of all the teams, and the drivers, even the drivers who are right at the back of the grid are, great characters that people have sort of know and have latched onto. And once you expand the cast of drivers, do you then begin to get, people care less and less and less about the guys far at the back? And then you're back to the problem that F1 had, 15 years ago, where people are very interested in the drivers at the front, but no one cares about the teams in the middle at the back. Like, the great success of Drive to Survive is that they've made people care about the teams in the middle and the back. But if you keep expanding the number of teams, it's going to be harder and harder to do that.
Talk for a moment about that, because you have a data point in the book that underscores how Drive to Survive has changed, where the cameras on the live action go from following the front to following the middle. Talk about that for a second, because it's a fascinating data point, I thought.
Yeah, what happened, it used to be that, if you were in the front, you commanded, I think it was more than a quarter of the total airtime, of a Grand Prix. But because of Drive to Survive and creating that interest in the midfield and even the teams at the back, what the classic example is Haas, a team that really just can't buy a good result right now, but had Gunther Steiner, who was the team principal, this kind of sweary Italian with an Austrian accent, who became a hero of the first 2-3 seasons of Drive to Survive. really raised that profile. And Haas became a kind of Keystone Cops that entertained fans. And so people wanted to see them on the broadcast too. And if you look at the distribution of airtime by position now within F1 and the broadcast of Grand Prix, you see it's much more evenly spread than that top-heavy broadcast we used to get. I remember growing up in Europe as a kid, you would never see a battle for 14th place on TV. You might hear about it and then hear when it happened, but we were still following Michael Schumacher going around in circles.
Yeah, I think the numbers were like pre-Drive to Survive, 35% of the coverage was on the front of it, and it dropped down to 20% now. And so that think about that. 15% of the time is now on following number 12, or because people know who Daniel Ricciardo is. I mean, as you both say, Daniel Ricciardo, I mean, no offense to him, but he's never been a terribly successful F1 driver, yet I know his name right off the top of my head because he's a star of the series and is so fun to watch. And so the idea that the camera goes back to watch Daniel Ricciardo in 14th position in an F1 race would never happen until Drive to Survive. It makes him, to some degree, a household name.
Yeah, and then that has other knock-on effects on the sport too, because now the cameras are showing more of the teams in the midfield. Well, that's great for them because they're getting much more exposure for their sponsors, and so they can start charging more, for sponsorships. There was a period, 15 years ago or so, when they used to think it was more valuable to be at the back than in the middle, because at least if you're at the back, the camera has to show you getting overtaken by the guy who's in the lead. So you're getting lapped. So it was better for the sponsors to sponsor a car that's right at the back, which actually is how Red Bull got in. Red Bull came into the sport trying to sponsor one of the teams at the back because they thought it was very subversive to do this thing where they would have the Red Bull name on the Sauber team, which was like one of the worst teams back then. And yeah, because they would then be shown when they were getting lapped by Michael Schumacher or Lewis Hamilton, or whoever it happened to be. Now, with a much more equitable distribution of airtime between the teams at the front and in the middle at the back, everyone gets, the chance to show their cars and their liveries and their sponsors. And it works out better for everyone. And that really is the sort of the great secret of why Drive to Survive has been such a success, is that every individual improvement and also has all these knock-on effects that then spiral and sort of snowball into making this big runaway hit.
So sort of double click on that for a second, Jonathan, because I think it's super important. A lot of people sit there and say, oh, well, Liberty came in 2017 and they brought in, new management, and they thought about it being of a media product rather than a sports product, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, just the fact that Liberty brought in Chase Carey to run it. I mean, if you think about Bernie Ecclestone being a used car salesman, but all the connectivity he had, and then all the other people who at various times have played a big role in F1. They have F1, if you will, they have race car driving in their blood to some degree. They were a designer, they were on a team, they were in the pits, whatever the case is. And now all of a sudden Liberty comes in and they pick a media executive who doesn't really know anything about F1. He doesn't know about cars, but he understands about how to new media, how to commercialize. He'd been at News Corp beforehand. I think about that decision that Maffei and Malone made to say, we can go, the current CEO of F1 came from Ferrari. He came from cars. He's the proper person for it today. But that move in 2017 was wildly, I think, risky, and B, innovative. Talk about why Chase Carey turned out to be the perfect first CEO for Liberty.
He had all that experience in kind of reinventing other sports for broadcast, and in combination with David Hill, one of the things that they had done at the Fox Sports regional networks was understanding that America is not a homogenous sports market. That if you live in Nebraska, number one sport to you might be in the fall watching your Nebraska Cornhuskers, and understanding that meant that it was just a different way of delivering kind of a watchable product that spoke the language of the people who were watching it. And so there was that at the Fox Sports regional networks, but what they also changed was kind of the DNA itself of sports broadcasts. David Hill, in his list of achievements prior to F1, counts inventing the score box in English soccer, for which he says he received death threats, inventing the first down line that is now essential to any NFL broadcast. And at one point, he even tried highlighting the puck in a hockey broadcast. That's one that didn't stick around.
Is he the one who's responsible for their names in when they're on the power play, the name of the person where they're touching the puck and it goes? Because if he is, he that one really bums me out. I wish they'd pull that one out. But to your point about following the puck, that was one technology that also didn't work that well. But anyway,
but so maybe you can understand why some people send him death threats over the other ones.
Yeah, exactly.
So with that, they realized that they were speaking to kind of the wrong audience, that kind of aging petrol head crowd that was following it because they were super into tire changes and things like that. It was just not working for F1 anymore. The broadcast was almost impenetrable. If you didn't know what you were watching or hadn't been watching since the beginning, you didn't really know who was where in the field. So what they did was, for instance, put the whole order of the cars on screen at all times. It seems basic, but it changes the way you watch it completely. You now see where those battles are. You see the gaps between the cars. He also, very importantly, realized, hey, these men who are risking their lives every other Sunday are heroes. Why can't we see their faces? So understanding that these guys were the gladiators in their arena and that they needed to be characters. Netflix didn't invent making F1 drivers into popular heroes. This was part of the F1 philosophy under Liberty to expand these characters and make sure that they didn't have their helmets on unless absolutely necessary. So as soon as they were out of the car, Liberty people were telling them, take off your helmet. We want to see your face. We want to see your Hollywood good looks. And we want to make sure that fans know what you look like so that they can build this human connection with them. All of these little things that are broadcast techniques, not precisely sports techniques, are what changed the feel and vibe of watching a Grand Prix.
Yeah, it's funny because actually one of Bernie Ecclestone's biggest accomplishment was recognizing that when he took over F1, he wasn't taking over a sport, he was taking over a television product. And that was his great insight and why he was able to sort of, turbocharge F1's fortunes. With Liberty, what they got is a company who knew what to do with the content that F1 was producing. And they really revolutionized what they were doing with that content.
Yeah. And the one other one that I thought was fascinating was when they started to put the sound between the pit crew and the drivers out. That was sort of, previously that's special sauce. You don't let them understand what the pit crew is saying to the driver during it. And now we all think of that as the narrative of the race, is what's going on and push and keep going. And so I thought that was another one that they pulled out that seemed somewhat heretical to Bernie, saying, how could we possibly let that out there? And now we all view that as the narrative of the race.
That's right. The whole paddock was an inner sanctum as far as Bernie was concerned. That the cameras and fans and visitors were not allowed in there. That was sacrosanct place for the teams to to work on their cars in secrecy. Liberty blew that wide open. They one of their first ideas was to get a mini train running through the paddock that fans could on the studio tours. The big Hollywood studio tours. They wanted to get a little train that would go through the paddock and take fans in and see what was happening. They had no interest in walling off what was happening behind there, and the fact that they have opened all that up and we've been able to see all the sort of drama that happens inside the garages and in the paddock during races is a large reason why the sport has found so many new viewers.
Right. And so that's not a chicken or the egg thing with Netflix. That was, Netflix comes out of that thinking, not the other way around.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a super important point to keep in mind. I did put forth, as we're talking about Netflix, whether, without COVID, whether it ever catches fire to the degree that it does. And I think it's pretty clear to say that they just had impeccable timing or luck, just like the Michael Jordan documentary that, we were all locked down and that was all we were watching. And all of a sudden people do watch, I don't know. I didn't know Max Verstappen's name before, Drive to Survive came out. So, I mean, that says something. A couple quick things as we wind down. One, I said we were going to talk about Abu Dhabi. I thought it was very humorous that you pulled out the quote from Toto, who was giving that speech at some Ernst & Young event, where he said there are three things you don't talk about: COVID, Trump, and Abu Dhabi 2021. But the ending of Abu Dhabi 2021, that race, I mean, was literally everything coming together. And I guess my question to the two of you is this: does it ever get any better? Like, if I'm Greg Maffei, I sit there and I say, we've got, Drive to Survive, we put in all these different things, we've got viewership up across the globe, and then we get this spectacle at the final that has more eyeballs on it than ever before. Is it ever going to get back to that? And I think you articulate in the book that it has continued to grow subsequently. But if I were the owner, I'd sit there and say, did I just hit peak viewership and peak drama around this, and is now the time for me to monetize this?
Well, as you rightly point out, that was really everything coming together. I mean, Abu Dhabi 21 is not that race, is not that spectacle, unless Liberty has brought in the race radios and the communications between the race director and the pit walls. We don't have the classic, no, Michael, this is so not right. We don't have any of that without Liberty deciding, long before it could have predicted that viewers would want to hear this too. Most of the conversations between the pit wall and the race director used to be quite dull. And suddenly here we are in Abu Dhabi, listening to team principals actually lobbying the race director to interpret the rules in a different way, and lobbying for their guy effectively to win the race, which is a crazy situation that, kind of calls to mind soccer players crowding around a referee, never changing his mind, of course, except this time it worked.
And it worked, and Michael Massey lost his job.
Exactly. So I don't think we can predict seeing that kind of perfect storm again, but you couldn't have predicted it the first time either. So it's all the conditions remain in place for craziness to happen. And that's kind of what Liberty is betting on. And it's not so much the idea that there is one peak, that there is one moment, but their bet is that they've created the conditions for these moments to happen on a semi-regular basis, that everything is there, and that a potential investor who might take it off their hands one day sees that and wants to also bet on that succession of moments.
Yeah. So my final question is this, and it has two parts to it. The first one is your next co-authored book on live golf? And in answering that question, do the Saudis end up buying F1?
So not going to be on live golf, although we have followed that saga closely. But yes, I think it seems like there's still a good chance that we know Saudi was interested in buying F1. We know that they haven't stopped investing in sports. They are currently in the process of sort of taking over professional boxing. As you mentioned, they've already got golf. They're involved in all sorts of soccer teams. They are going to have the Soccer World Cup in 36. Is that right, Josh? 36, 32,
34.
36? 34. I don't know. I mean, whether they end up buying F1. I mean, they already very much invested in F1. Aramco is the sort of main sponsor for F1. So I don't know that they will necessarily go through with buying the series, but certainly they're going to remain heavily invested in it. And were they to buy it, it would come as no surprise.
Josh, so it's clear you guys aren't going to write on live golf. So then maybe my question to you, after Jonathan said that, is what's the next book? What's the next piece of sports history, given your three books and how riveting the three of them are, that we can think the two of you are going to dive in on?
We're still in the process of working that out, but we'll let you know when we have it, because we'd love to do this again.
Well, I am super appreciative of both of your time. The book is fantastic. It really is a fantastic read. To anyone who's listening to this webcast, go buy it. I've covered just the surface of it, but there's some really incredible data in there, and the history and the way you put it all together is just fantastically done. So Josh and Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time, and everyone for joining us this week on the Walker Webcast. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both very much. Really appreciate it.